So for 25 years, since you asked, I'm going to go a little deeper down this hole, and I think listeners around the world will appreciate, because it does affect them, right?
Oh, this affects everyone. This affects everybody.
This affects everyone. So especially at today's day and age, and the current culture and relationship between civilians and law enforcement worldwide could not be any lower than it currently is. So I'm going to speak on this, and when you want me to shut up, you tell me to shut up. But in the meantime, we have to address this point, because you said it comes down to budget, comes down to money. Now, interestingly, I've identified this to be the truth. So when I've spoken to police chiefs over the last 20 plus years, and I say, why not? They say, Henner, training costs money. We have limited budget, so we don't have the funds to give officers more than 4 hours a year of training. Okay, on the surface, it sounds like a legitimate argument. But what I've always believed anecdotally was that police officers who are better trained are going to sustain less injuries to themselves in uses of force. They're going to cause less injuries to civilians, and they're going to allow for fewer lawsuits against the agency. So I always felt that if you really dug into the numbers, that money would actually be saved by having better trained officers. That was my hypothesis. But again, because I'm not a police officer, I couldn't jump into an agency and force these new training mandates to prove my hypothesis. Well, as fate would have it, one of the agencies that we've been working with for 12 years in Marietta, Georgia, a police department where we've been saying to them, look, they need more training on a weekly basis. This has to be the case. One of these agencies had an incident take place in their city where officers who were poorly trained, because they only get 4 hours a year or less, they went in and they brutalized a person in a breakfast restaurant called IHOP. After this incident that went viral on YouTube and social media, the community crashed down on the agency. And at that point, the chief and the command staff at the agency had to ask the question, how are we going to scrutinize these police officers for poor performance when we never gave them the training that they need, the sufficient training to perform proficiently in a worst case use of force encounter? How can we blame them if they weren't equipped to begin with? So they tried something crazy, Paddy. They decided to send a group of police officers to a local civilian-owned Brazilian Jiu Jitsu school that was carefully vetted, and they created a partnership where those officers could train at the school at no cost to the officers. It was sponsored by the agency, and they were allowed to train weekly like regular Jiu Jitsu students, in with the rest of the students, like in with the civilians, just participating in Jiu Jitsu. So they did this for 18 months, and out of 145 officers at the agency, 95 officers opted in to this opportunity to get this free training at the agency. Now, after 18 months, they had all these officers that were training weekly, and they had data of those officers in their performance in law enforcement, and they were able to compare that 18 months of data to the 18 months before the initiation of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu supplementary training program for these officers. And the results were astonishing to the world, but
not
for
to
me,
us.
they were exactly what I had been alluding to for the last 20 years. So listen to this, bro. You won't believe it. There was a 48% reduction in officer injuries during use of force encounter, meaning officers were less likely to get hurt when they went hands-on in the field, and as a result, the workman's comp claims, right, the liability for the agency of the officer injuries, workers' comp, the claims went down of injured officers, which saved the agency just under $70,000 in that 18-month period. So because cops weren't getting hurt, the agency saved money because they didn't have to pay for injured officers. The second data point was when an officer was trained in jiu-jitsu that interacted with the civilian was 53% less likely to be hospitalized. Now think about that. So if you're going to get arrested by a cop, you would think, the general public thinks that better trained police officers are going to be more injurious to the civilian. They're wrong. The poorly trained officers cause greater injuries by 53%. So you're more than twice as likely to be hospitalized if you get arrested by an untrained officer than if you get arrested by one of these 95 officers who had been training weekly jiu-jitsu. So think about the numbers associated with that. So now you have better trained officers, less injuries to the officers, less injuries to the public. And naturally, although we can't measure this, you can imagine, Paddy, how the reduction in injuries to civilians also results in a reduction in likelihood of lawsuits against the agency for excessive force allegations, because they're simply not hurting as many civilians. So now we have the data. Now, the irony of all of this is that the cost of training those officers over 18 months was $26,000. The overall saved income, saved finances rather, from the reduction in injuries to officers was $70,000. So the net profit for the agency for instituting better training was over $40,000. The city saved over $40,000 that they would have otherwise spent on injured officers. They saved that money because they trained their officers, which cost less than the money that they saved. So for the first time in history, there is data to point to the fact that a better trained officer group, a better trained police department actually saves the city money, even when we're talking about training 1 to 2 hours a week on a weekly basis, so these officers can generate muscle memory and reflexes that are going to be needed in that high intensity situation. So this is the data I've been dreaming of for 20 years, Paddy, and it's changing everything in law enforcement. We're right at the center of it. Our program, GST, is the go-to program for most agencies in the country when it comes to jiu-jitsu. So it's just been a crazy ride. And this is all happening in the last 24 to 48 months. Like, it's been very recent that these changes are happening. So it couldn't be a worse relationship between public and the law enforcement community, but we couldn't be headed in a better direction when it comes to training officers in a way that will reduce injuries to civilians, the injuries that could have been avoided. That's the key for me. If the injury and the lethal force can be avoided, jiu-jitsu will help avoid it.
Yeah, where you said there about like other people not realising how much money it'd save and stuff. To me and you, because we do jiu-jitsu and we understand the martial art, we know full well how much that was going to save them. Know what I mean? We just know because, as you say, muscle memory. I know as soon as someone puts their hands on me from behind, I'm grabbing hold of a Kimura or I'm turning and I'm going into something else and I'm getting them down. Where, if, as you say, if a police officer doesn't know anything like that and someone grabs them from behind, they're going to pull the gun out and shoot because they don't know anything else, as you say. For me, I say fight or flight. You're going to fight or you're going to run, and it's one or the other. But as you say, you've got to invest money to make money, and that's what the police forces should think. Like, invest money in how good our officers are when it comes to arresting people in the job, rather than thinking, oh, no, we can't put that money in there because we want it for other things.
And you know what it is, Paddy, is that, interestingly, law enforcement officers have always been disastrously underprepared. The only difference now is that cameras are everywhere.
Yeah, social media.
So the accountability for these officers, there's 17 cameras recording every interaction between law enforcement and the public. So they have to be better trained. So this is the time where all the agencies who've been poorly performing forever, now they're having to button up and they have to, stand by. Now they're having to button up and to get their tactics right because the public expects more from them than what they're currently seeing. And ironically, when you tell the public, all police officers in America should be trained in Gracie survival tactics, should be trained in jiu-jitsu, the response is going to be, no way. Why would we want to teach dangerous techniques to officers? That's the general public's misguided perception. When the reality is, look at the Marietta, Georgia Police Department data. You want every officer in your city as trained as possible, because if you have a bad day, you have too much to drink, and you behave poorly in society, and you have to get arrested, the question is, do you want your police officer who's arresting you or your mom or your brother or your uncle, do you want that officer to be trained or untrained? That's the question everyone has to ask. And if the answer is you want them trained, well, then guess what? We got to start pushing for this type of overhaul in defensive tactics throughout the country. And that's literally what I spend most of my waking hours focusing on, is how to continuously break down these barriers and get more police departments understanding this. And of course, the politics and how all the finances work in, where ultimately they're saving money by getting their officers better trained in their agency.